Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
So I guess here we go.
Here we go. Well, I heard you've been getting a little bit of burning done.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, knocked out a little bit more yesterday. Been trying to get one or two in a week here lately. Most of it on my research plots.
Yeah.
And that's specifically on that project where we're comparing fire to other vegetation management options, maybe for people that can't burn. But the burn data in itself is going to be good too, because we've got fire on its own, and we've got fire paired with two different herbicides to look at the interactive effects and see maybe does that create better vegetation structure and composition for turkeys, things like that.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, I got to do a little burning myself.
Yeah?
Yeah.
With the master?
With the master. Yeah, so, we're developing this online turkey habitat training. You participated in it, but we've been going around and recording different folks on their specialty area. And we had to go up to do that with Craig Harper. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be launching this training opportunity soon. It's pretty intensive. But while we were up there, it was, we had a couple of good burn days, so we just went out and burned some upland hardwood stands.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was a lot of fun. It's also kind of, sentimental, I guess, because one of the places was where I really cut my teeth on habitat management.
Yeah, that's cool.
And, getting to go back and see those stands. We're 25 years into the management on some of that stuff, and getting to burn again on those.
25 years, according to most people, it's a miracle that any of those trees are still alive,
I know. Well, one of the things, we have some content. So if y'all follow us on YouTube, we will have videos coming on these. But we get a lot of flack about burning in upland hardwoods.
Right.
And I'm going to damage all my trees. Well, one of the places that we burned, we did some content that we'll produce on this, so you'll be able to see it. But Craig has, and I've been involved a little bit, but Craig is obviously spearheading it because it's right beside his house. We've got an upland woodlot that he has burned 18 years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And all the oaks in that bad boy still look just fine.
Yeah. Yep.
And the mid story is absent, and the ground cover is herbaceous primarily, and
yeah,
all the trees are still producing acorns. In fact, there's acorns laying around everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I think part of people's perception of burning, and I know this is not supposed to be a burning episode, but here we go. We're gonna go ahead and share some thoughts, because it is a relevant time of the year. But
yeah,
I would agree with people based on how I see the average burn conducted across the sites that I visit.
Mm-hmm.
I see why they have concerns about burning in hardwoods, because they burn too dang hot.
Yeah. Well, we went through that very thing. It's not that you can't damage the overstory. You can.
You can damage pine trees just the same.
Yeah, we can kill longleaf.
Yeah.
If we want to, but we're trying to use practices under the set of conditions that are allowing us to control the intensity of fire and behavior of fire such that we don't damage them. And you can do that in upland hardwoods.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed is I get more experience burning with a greater diversity of people, is that a lot of those people that have prior burn experience comment on how slow and careful I burn.
Yeah.
Because they're not used to seeing that. And I'm not talking about so slow and careful that I can't get anything done. I mean, I can still get a pretty good bit done, and the conditions are going to dictate that, and the site's going to dictate that. But I think a lot of people see examples of folks that get an area blacked in and they get it contained, and then they just rip fire through it,
Mhm.
with using the wind,
Yeah.
and that's
It's
you
not
know
necessarily needed to meet your objectives. We'll
it's
put
not
it that way.
wrong. It's not necessarily wrong, but it can be, depending on what your
Yeah.
objectives are.
Well, and that's one thing I'm excited about this content that we'll have because we keep getting so much about burning up on hardwood. So we were like, we're going to show you how to do it.
Hmm.
Here are the scenarios. So we have multiple videos and did burn in different scenarios, but the south side management zones where he's gone in and intentionally killed a lot of the trees and tried to get a high sunlight as south facing slopes or drier, and we ripped it through those like a completely different thing,
Yeah,
but the objectives are different.
right.
So, you know, uh, I think that'll be really good stuff. But also, I do acknowledge that's not why we're here today.
Yeah,
So we could, I guess, make it a burning and upland hardwood show, but that wasn't our intent. So if you're interested in this, leave us some comments. We can come back to it. Also, we're going to have some content, popping up soon on YouTube, so folks can see what we're talking about. But we're not going to belabor it anymore here on the podcast today.
I don't know. That does sound like an easier episode to just sit around and talk
Oh
about our
man,
burn experiences.
yeah, we could rock and roll on that one, but I'd hate for you to have wasted all the time you spent doing a deep dive on roosting behavior,
Yeah,
which we've been getting, I'd say, a fair amount. It's definitely one of the most common requests is to do something on roosting.
yeah. Well, the time of year it is, is the way most people think about it. We're coming out of burn season and heading into turkey season. As we have mentioned many, many times on this podcast before, I wish you wouldn't think about it like that.
Yeah,
We want people expanding their burn window
yeah.
as much
See
as
the fire season
possible.
episode from
Yes,
3 ago.
yes, to get at all the acres that they need to accomplished.
Hmm.
But you know, it's inarguable that we are heading into turkey season, right? So like youth
Oh yeah,
season opened last weekend in Mississippi. I think the main season opens this weekend, or yeah, it is this weekend because today's
yeah. We've been rocking and rolling for a little while here in Florida already.
yeah, and that's what I was gonna say. Is Florida's open? We're about 12 days out from Alabama's opener, so it is upon us, and people want to know where birds are roosted, right?
Yeah,
And also, maybe how they can manage around those roosts and things like
yeah,
that.
yeah. You know what I would like? I know a lot of our audience has shifted to YouTube since we've started uh, trying to incorporate visuals with this. So I would like for folks to just drop us a line what kind of trees and in what kind of situation, vegetation type wise, are your turkeys roosting in?
Hmm.
Because I kind of have an idea, and I've been on a bunch of properties and hear where they're roosting, but I'm just kind of curious if anybody has examples that I'm not familiar with and that you're not going to cover here.
Yeah.
So if y'all are listening on YouTube, drop us a note on that.
Yeah, and another thing, if I can demand one more thing from our audience,
Could you
is
please?
is while you're leaving those comments, if you have ever, this is something I'm increasingly interested in with in working with landowners on managing for turkeys, is disturbance around roost sites. And I would be interested to know if you've ever had a roost site that turkeys used year after year, and then something happened and they quit using it, and why you think that is.
Yeah. Or did you do something that caused them to move in and now it's a roost site
That's
every
a
year?
really good question too. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, I'd love to hear from folks on this.
Yeah, because I've got some ideas on that, and maybe we'll talk about it at the end. Some of
Yeah.
our opinions on management around roost sites.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think, one of the things people might be wondering, why are they trying to get our audience to chime in on here? Sort of like citizen science, because one of the things that I gathered from you and that I've gathered from looking around the literature myself is we don't have that much data published on it,
No,
ironically.
the roosting literature is surprisingly, can I use the word depauperate?
Can you spell it? That's
I
the question.
can. I can.
Uh,
Spelling bee champ,
there's
1993,
no
buddy.
way when you start putting A's and U's in the same word multiple times. Is it in there more than one time? I think there's only one V in there. No, the reason I'm saying that's sort of ironic is because as turkey hunters, that's something that we're mapping out constantly.
Absolutely.
Like if you're hunting turkeys off the roost, you're by intent finding roosts every morning, and you would think that we would just have 150 papers on that because of all these birds we've tagged everywhere, and it just hadn't been that strong of a focus. There's several contributions, but it's just hasn't been that strong of a focus in a lot of the research.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of what I found, and this, I think that's the data we're probably going to get into first, is just general descriptions of the trees, the types and their characteristics that turkeys roost in. But there's a little bit about, how often do they go back to the same site? Do they roost in the same area night after night?
Yeah.
That kind of thing that is starting to emerge. And I know that the Chamberlain and his folks at UGA have contributed a lot to that. They've got
I
like
was going to say, I
couple
know with
couple papers out on it now.
the roost site fidelity, I remember him talking about this somewhere that I either saw or heard him talk about it.
Right. So there is increasing amounts of data on that, but it's still fairly sparse considering how important it is to these birds,
Yeah. Well, we are acknowledging that roosting is probably very important to their survival.
Right.
Right. It's getting them elevated and out of the harm's way, potentially providing them cover, that's helping for, the elements and conservation of energy as well. But obviously, not getting eaten
Yeah.
is a pretty important one.
Yeah. What has always been, or maybe more recently has become most perplexing to me about this whole conversation is that in most places you would expect Easterns to be able to roost wherever they wanted to, especially after you go down and you spend some time in Rio country and see some of the places that Rios roost. You would think, oh, well, the entire property is a roost.
Yeah.
You know,
Everywhere you want.
on the average property in Alabama or Florida or Georgia or the Carolinas.
Well,
But
especially
it's
like you go
not.
up
It
into
doesn't work like that.
you go up into the southern Appalachians in
Yeah.
some of those places, and it's like, oh, it's all mature oak forests with these rolling hills, or you get up into the mountains and little steeper terrain even, but they aren't just randomly distributing their roosts across that, even though from a individual tree quality, it might be relatively ubiquitous.
Yeah.
They seem to be much more selective in the landscape than that.
Yeah. Well, here's an example of it. We'll just go ahead and get started. But going back to the 40s, we were
The
talking about,
1940s.
yeah, the 1940s. We were talking about a lot of this literature is relatively old, but this paper was by Mosby and Hanley, two big names, obviously,
Ooh, Mosby.
in the turkey world.
Yeah.
And this study was from Virginia
I
to
was gonna
play
say
into your
Virginia.
Southern Appalachian example. And in that state where they did their research, most roost trees had a DBH of 10 to 20 inches. Okay.
10 to 20. Okay.
That's not
So
hard to find. That's not hard to find.
Yeah, I was like, okay, so from here to here.
I mean, a 10-inch diameter tree is not that big.
Yeah.
And you would think in Virginia it wouldn't be hard to find, but then this is something else that I started thinking about too as I was going back through this, because so much of it is dated, is we think of the Virginia landscape now, but you're talking about this is 80 years ago.
Yeah. It was probably a lot more open then.
There was
I would
probably
guess.
a lot less sustainable forestry going on. There was a lot more clear cutting, a lot younger forest on average
Mhm.
across the landscape than we have now, which
Probably
comes
a
with
lot
its
more
which
fire on the ground.
probably and that comes with its own suite of problems, but just like the situation that we're in now comes with its own suite of different problems, right? So maybe they were cutting too much and there was too much open ground then, and maybe there's not enough of it now. But that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah. You know what else there wasn't? I just got to add this in.
Okay.
There's no sod forming, not native grass. And I know where you wanted to go.
We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't think in the 40s people were. Never mind.
Yeah.
So 10 to 20-inch trees. They also noted, I thought it was interesting, we talked about how important roosting is for anti-predator, as an anti-predator strategy. They noted that the bowl was typically clean for the first 20 to 30 feet. So no limbs below 20 to 30 feet, which, obviously would give a predator, especially, like a bobcat or something else that has to climb, an advantage to trying to get to the turkeys.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, and then they also noted that the branches on average were about 2 to 4 inches, so fairly large branches, which we know, turkeys like to grab onto.
Mm-hmm.
Gives them kind of a secure base.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So moving on from
So
there.
with this one,
Oh,
were they just, I assume they were just like going out and finding roost sites and then measuring stuff later
yes,
because we didn't have radio tags.
that's right.
So, okay. Makes
So
sense. I mean, we do it all the time, right? When
yeah,
we're going out and finding a gobbler.
that's right. They were just making it a little bit more systematic than we do as hunters. Just finding where turkeys are roosting and then measuring the characteristics of the trees. Now, as we get into some of these older or some of these newer papers, there were a little bit more sophisticated methods that were used. But that's how a lot of these earlier studies were conducted. So we jump on from there, and these aren't in any particular chronological order. I did try to keep them kind of grouped by region. So kind of jumping down to the deep south now. There's a paper by Smith and Teitelbaum in 1986. It took place in Louisiana, and they noted that pine plantations that were 11 to 20 years old were most used for roosting, as well as mixed hardwood pine stands.
I'm kind
So
of surprised about that.
that's the one thing that surprised me the most about that was that the age range on the plantation went down as low as 11 years.
Yeah. They're sitting on a twig at the top. I mean,
And so that is another aspect of some of this historical stuff that makes me think, keep in mind the context of that era and what forest management looked like. Maybe in the 80s in Louisiana, there wasn't as much mature forest. And so they were more
yeah.
reliant on those younger trees.
Well, the other thing is, was it truly selection or just use?
I don't have all those details.
Yeah. That's one thing I'd be,
I think they were just noting use on that one.
yeah. So if the whole landscape is 11-year-old pine, if there are turkeys and that's all they have to roost on, then that's what they're going to do.
That's
It
right.
did bring back I've got a few memories like this, but the most recent one, one of my longtime friends from high school has some property over in Mississippi, and I've gone hunting with him a few times. And we had a turkey just hammering it that we were going to, and we were walking through pine plantation, and both of us thought the turkey was
Yeah, you knew he
outside
wasn't
of
going to
it.
be in that plantation.
Yeah, because the trees, I mean, they weren't roost trees,
Yeah.
so we're just like hauling it through down this little logging road trying to get on the other side of the pine. And, we were going to slow down when we got toward the edge of the pine, but to us, that stand was just providing cover.
Uh-huh.
And we misjudged him and we blew him off of this little bitty pine tree.
Yeah. Well, if
And
you
I
remember
was,
a couple years ago, you and I kind of did the same thing. So we were walking
oh, we
it.
did
We
that.
were we
Yeah.
were going we were going to a turkey, walking through. It was
Yeah.
like
The one
it was a
that
pine
you,
plantation that was just about ready to be thinned at that size and age class, if y'all can picture that. And as we were walking down that road, we had a recent rain, so the ground was still a little bit soft, and there were gobbler tracks, right? And they were super fresh. And I remember we even commented, one of us commented at one point, it's like, we're going to come around a bend in this road and see that gobbler standing in those tracks eventually because they look so fresh. And sure enough, we got to a point and we came around a curve and one that gobbler flushed right out of one of those little pine trees.
Yeah, he was sitting up on the limb.
And then we ended up killing a gobbler a little while later. I don't know if it was him. We couldn't be certain.
Well, that was the other thing that was odd about that is it was late, like it was daylight.
Oh, yeah.
That was way after fly down.
Yeah, because we even speculated maybe he heard us coming and he decided to fly up in one of those trees.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We thought we had ruined it, but, we made good on it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Jay Exum found something similar, same time period in the 80s.
South Alabama.
That was out South Alabama, and he noted that most roosts were in pine plantations that were at least 14 years old.
That makes sense.
At least, not like Smith and Teitelbaum, it was 11 to 20. Going on, Fleming and Webb, 1974. This was in South Carolina. They noted that 54% of roost observations of gobblers were in pine hardwood forest, and loblolly was most often the species used to roost.
Loblolly?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know. This is something that struck me too when I was going through these. I was like, I did not expect relatively young, small loblollies to be as important as they were in these studies. But once again, I'm thinking that this is from an era where we were logging and practicing forestry very different than we do today. So that was the only thing I could come up with that would play a role in it. Or maybe I'm just underestimating the role of loblolly pine plantation and roost sites, but that has not been my experience as a hunter.
Yeah. I'm sure that people are commenting on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't if it's, even when it is a dominant vegetation type on the landscape, I still wouldn't expect that much use of it. Not at 14 years old.
Right.
Especially back then. A 14-year-old tree back then was not the same as a 14-year-old tree now.
Even smaller, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we get a little bit more recent, moving on to Smith and others, 1990. This was in Mississippi, and they noted that in pine stands that had SMZs, so we use that to abbreviate streamside management zones, which are oftentimes just a strip of undisturbed hardwoods along, any little creek or drain area through a pine stand.
Just wet, yeah.
Basically, the hardwoods between pine stands that you see so often throughout all the deep South states. So in pine stands with those SMZs, turkeys roosted in the pine stands and the SMZs in proportion to their availability. Which that surprised me too, because you would expect stronger selection for the SMZ relative to its availability than you would the plantation.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Right. So now they are doing selection.
And
they're looking at it what I mean by that, they're looking at use as it relates to availability to be used.
Yeah.
And they were in proportion to their availability. I would have never thought that. Did it say anything about the age of the pines?
No, it didn't. Not that
if we were in late rotation, sure.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting.
And it's, the other thing I'll add here, they had tagged birds. So they went in there and found the roost.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
I know there's at least 2 or 3 people sitting there like, oh, there's no way. They had tags on them.
Yeah.
So.
You know what I'm picking up, Marcus?
What you picking up?
We need more pine plantation.
I don't think that's the answer.
I'm being completely facetious right now, but it's hard.
Turkeys ought to be doing awesome if that's the case, because we got a pine belt. It's more like a pine sash or something, Got a pine garment.
Yeah. Pine sash. All right, so let's get into a little bit more recent data.
One of them big thick belts.
And this is interesting because I do feel like, so everything mostly with a couple exceptions that I'm going to present from here on out is more recent and is more interestingly in line with our expectations. So
wait, do you still have some Roost papers?
Yeah, I'm still on Roost. I'm still on Roost papers. Yeah.
I thought you were going to transition to something else.
No.
I was going to say, do we not have anything outside the Eastern Range?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
So Chamberlain and others, 2000, Mississippi. This was with hens. Everything that I've mentioned up until this point was gobblers or both sexes.
Okay.
Okay, so this is hen
That's
specific.
important.
And they stated that females preferred to roost in saw timber pine. Not surprising. So generally
Makes
speaking,
sense.
nowadays that's over a 14-inch tree.
Yeah.
Um,
Good size pine.
yeah, and pine hardwood stands near water. Meets
Perfect.
expectations, right? And
Hmm.
the stands tended to be older than what was available on average across the study area. That makes sense.
Makes sense. Yep.
That's completely aligned with my expectations. Jumping over to North Carolina, this study was by Sasmal. I'm hopefully
Yeah.
pronouncing it right. Sasmal.
Yeah, I'm the author on this one.
You were on that paper, 2018. So Fort Bragg, North Carolina, hens, and those hens roosted in upland longleaf pine proportional to its availability. They selected for bottomland hardwood and avoided upland hardwood. And so, since that was longleaf pine on sandy soils, my assumption would be that that upland hardwood was scrub oak type species.
Yeah, it's definitely smaller trees generally.
Yeah,
That that's not to say there aren't some upland hardwoods that are large, big, large canopy trees, but they're relatively few and far between in that landscape. And as one of the people that helped delineate the upland hardwood, it was a little scraggly turkey oak
that's
primarily.
that's exactly what I was envisioning. So that one is not that surprising. They
Yeah,
roost in some longleaf about as much as it's available. So that's
yep,
not a surprise, and they are specifically targeting roost sites in bottomland hardwood, which is what I think
yeah,
probably all of our listeners would expect to hear.
yeah. And my perception as someone who loves to hunt, but also has tracked turkeys around, look where they're roosting as well. My perception in that kind of landscape, not just at Fort Bragg, but in this kind of setting, is that the roosts are often in the ecotone.
Yeah,
So in other words, they're at the edge of the bottomland hardwood and the upland hardwood where you have characteristics of both. So you
right.
might have a mix of pine and hardwood in that little strip, and you know you've got fairly high productivity right there.
Yeah,
And also, it's kind of where the fire is ending, right? Because of moisture,
yeah.
the
Well,
influence of fire is not as strong.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was also thinking about those ecotones, those edges. That's typically where we see fire intensity dial back a little bit as you get into higher fuel moisture, more shady conditions, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I wish that more of these studies that I just went through had also collected measurements of under and mid-story conditions at each of these roost sites because that's
that's
something that I feel
something.
like we're missing out
Yeah,
on sorely.
well, that's one thing I was going to say. I think you've got I know that there's a couple of them, so I'm assuming that you dug them up. There are a couple where they identify the tree species and characteristics about the tree. I think you've already covered one or two, but I I can't remember one that's characterized the ground
Yeah.
level vegetation like the understory or midstory.
The only thing that I've ever come across like that was, and this is what's really interesting, and our people that are listening in Rio country will be mad to hear me say this, but a lot of the roosting literature that we do have is from Rios because roost sites are so much more limiting throughout their range. I chose not to include a bunch of those papers, although I do have some data on Rios that we're going to get into in just a second. Simply because most of our listeners aren't in the range of Rio, so and that situation is so
Yeah,
unique to them. But that being said, I did find some papers where they had looked at the effects of the surrounding vegetation on roost site selection in Rio country, and they generally found that on average those roost sites have more open conditions at near ground level than the areas that were not used for roosting. So, and that makes sense. I mean, we
yeah,
know that turkeys don't want to fly up in a roost area that has a bunch of shrubby vegetation throughout it that they can't see well
yeah.
into.
Yeah, and then have to land down into that.
Yeah, it's just like hard to take off and land in, let alone the potential predator avoidance strategy that
Hmm.
they might want to employ by roosting somewhere where they can see everything around them.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Do you remember the names on any of those papers? We could at least link it if folks want to go.
I don't. I'd have to go back and look. Maybe we can get that in time for the show notes.
Yeah. So the other thing I was going to say, in that Lonely Pine ecotone, situation, what I can say is the uplands were frequently burned, and that's typical in Lonely like that, right? And it also importantly, the fire was allowed to interact with the drainage.
Yeah,
So those ecotone areas were really clear of that mid story.
yeah,
It was developed understory, and the composition was a little different than the uplands or the bottomlands because it was sharing species. But it would still be, they were burning directly on into it, and that was keeping the vegetation structure really desirable from my perspective.
and that makes me wonder. Going back to those papers where we were surprised at how often they used relatively small pine trees to roost in. Do you think most of those are from like the 70s, 80s era? Do you think that they were using more prescribed fire in those stands then than we are now, and maybe that was a contributing factor to it?
I suspect they were because we didn't have the herbicides developed for competition at that
So they
point.
almost had to.
Yeah.
That was their only vegetation control strategy.
Yeah. And, that also, I was thinking about that when you were talking about Virginia, back in those days, we were using fire to clean up places like
Hmm.
hedgerows and fence rows and all that kind of stuff. So I suspect there was quite a bit more fire on the ground in that
Yeah,
context
yeah.
back then.
That's interesting to think about either way.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on. I've got one more kind of general studies like that. This one's by Kimmel and Zwank, 1985. And they noted that flooded riverfront hardwood forests were preferred roosting sites in the flooded bottomland hardwood forest adjacent to the Mississippi River. So, Mississippi Delta region, not surprising, flooded riverfront hardwood forests were preferred.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Makes sense, stands to reason, right?
Roost over water.
Oh, I lied on that one. I do actually have a couple of more general studies. This one is to our listeners further north will appreciate this. And I was actually talking the other week to one of our seminar workshop attendees, and he had been noting that that white pine was a preferred roost tree in his neck of the woods, and he's based out of Ohio, I'm pretty sure. And
Okay.
he noted a lot of use of white pine, and I had just started doing some episode prep the week of the seminar, so I'd come across this paper, and I shared a little bit of what I learned from it with him, and he thought that was really interesting how it aligned with his observations. Anyway, the paper's from Kilpatrick and others, published in 1988, Winter Roost Site Characteristics of Eastern Wild Turkeys in Rhode Island. And in this study, they had 9 sites that turkeys were using as established winter roost. So these were probably perennial roost sites that they knew that there were going to be turkeys hanging out in every winter. So not during the turkey season, just to be clear on that.
Hmm.
And they compared the characteristics of those sites that were known roosts to 9 random plots that they chose throughout that forest. And so their general findings were that roost sites were closer to open water than random plots. So the average distance between a roost site and open water was 40 meters compared to almost 300 meters for a random plot that they, if they just drop a pin anywhere on the property, that was the average distance to water.
Yeah, so it's 10, almost 10 times, 8 times farther on average, just
Yeah.
randomly than you would be. So that's pretty clear selection for water
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
being near water,
Well,
not actual water.
you know why they like to roost at or near water, right?
So
According
they
to
can see the fish.
according to Tom Kelly. Have you ever read that
Why is
line by
that?
Tom Kelly?
I don't remember it.
I can't even remember which book of his it was in, but I think it was something to the effect of he got so tired of people asking him that question, he came up with kind of a smart ass reply to it, which is that they like the sound of their shit hitting the water.
Classic line.
I mean, that's a pretty strong Tom Kelly quote there. It seems to
Yeah.
kind of match what I've heard about his personality and inferred it from reading his writing.
Yeah, that's funny.
So they were closer to open water, as I just covered. They also noted that the mean DBH, diameter at breast height, was 19 inches at Roost compared to 8 in controls.
Say that again?
Mean DBH was 19 inches at Roost compared to 8 at control sites, or random sites, rather.
So more than double the size.
Yeah. And
Wow.
that's what I would expect.
Yeah,
That's more
those
aligned with my
big
expectations.
trees. Yeah.
They
That
also
makes sense.
noted, and keep in mind that this was during wintertime, so some routes were used for up to 14 consecutive nights. There were turkeys in them every night for 2 weeks. I thought this was interesting just because I've never seen anybody else describe it. But the number of trees that they used ranged from 1 to 7 for a flock size of 12 to 15 birds.
So they're commonly multiple birds in the same tree.
Yeah, that's right. But then you get down to a smaller flock size, they were noting that if you had like a flock of like 3 hens, let's just say, that flock of 3 would use somewhere between 1 and 3 trees as the roost site, all kind of clustered together. They preferred white pine, and then finally they noted that the roost trees were the tallest trees at each of the sites.
Yeah.
All things that you would expect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got one more from up north. We're going all the way crossing the border into Ontario for this one. So this is Adey, Adey et al., published in 2023, and the title of the paper is Seasonal Roost Selection of Wild Turkeys at Their Northern Range Edge.
Yeah,
And
I did a video, like a reel on this one, I think, when it came out.
okay, well, I'm sure you'll have some input on it too.
Yeah, we can link it. I don't remember the details now.
Okay, it's hard to retain everything, but so the way they approached it is they compared 48 trees that were actual roost trees to 48 random trees that were non-roost trees, and as you would expect, the roost trees were taller and bigger around. Specifically, the roost trees on average were 70 feet tall. The non-roost trees were 60 feet tall. The DBH, diameter at breast height, for the roost trees on average was 23 inches compared to 15 inches for non-roost trees. Sugar maple was the most preferred species in that study.
Mm-hmm. I did remember that.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting to me about that paper is, they looked at different seasons throughout it, and one of their hypotheses was that turkeys would specifically choose to roost in cooler trees that provided, cooler temperatures during the summertime. But they actually found, and this was counterintuitive to me, that temperatures at deciduous roosts were higher than temperatures at coniferous roosts, and higher than the ambient temperature out in the open. So that was counter to what I expected. I would have
Is this
thought
like at the roost height or at the ground?
I was never able to determine that. Maybe it was just somewhere in the paper and I didn't, I just glossed over it or whatever. But I couldn't tell exactly where and how they were measuring the temperature. But it was hotter at deciduous roost than it was in coniferous roost or compared to the ambient air temperature. I assume that it had to be at the roost height because at ground level we know that a deciduous forest in summer is going to be cooler.
Yeah, unless the sites that were being selected were much more open, I don't see how that could be. Like as a deciduous forest that's been thinned down to 40 basal area or something.
I doubt it.
I
I don't think
doubt
they're
it too.
doing that much in Ontario.
Yeah, well, I wonder if we have any listeners from Ontario. Give us a shout out if you're in Ontario.
All right.
Yeah, so well that's interesting. I guess the type of tree, the size and shape of the tree, and where it is in the landscape are all pretty clearly being selected.
Yeah, and it may also depend on what's available. I mean, surely it depends on what's available in the landscape as well. I think you could
Yeah,
expect as like if you took a plot of land and on average the trees were smaller and shorter there, turkeys are going to have to roost in smaller, shorter trees
Yeah.
than they would on a site where there's larger ones available.
Right.
yeah, that's really interesting.
What else can we take away from what we've gone through so far before we start getting into the fidelity stuff and things like that?
Well, I thought it was, the use of the smaller pines, that was odd. We've already belabored that, I think, but
Yeah.
I I found it pretty curious about how many turkeys were using the same tree, like potentially in that one study, and I think it was the same one that you talked about there being turkeys roosted in the same group of trees 14 days in a row or up to that.
It was. Yeah, same study.
And I guess they don't know if they were the same turkeys or did they have them tagged.
I don't remember.
But I know we're getting to the site fidelity part, but that I didn't think that they were staying in the same roost night after night after night most of the time.
Yeah. So I know you haven't analyzed the data on this yet, but if you feel comfortable talking about it, what have you been seeing as far as the roost site fidelity in your gobblers down there in the Osceola's range?
It's still very preliminary, but I would say there's relatively high site fidelity
Okay.
where I feel like there's a few places where they're going back to it over and over.
On average, would you expect that that landscape is more open and
Yes, it's
less
definitely
forested than most of, the rest of the deep south outside of Florida?
yeah, definitely is.
See, and we're about to get into this, but I think that roost site fidelity is probably a function of availability of suitable roost sites.
That could be.
Because we see that a little bit in Rios. This is where we're going to get into some of the Rio
Yeah.
stuff, where there appears to be a little bit more fidelity in Rios than there does in Easterns, and that makes sense.
Yeah, and on the site that I've looked at the most of it, that certainly could be the case. It's definitely more open
Yeah,
of a landscape, and it's like these depressional wetlands that have hardwoods around them are kind of scattered across the landscape, but a large portion of it's open. But I have data on other sites that are not like that. They're
yeah,
forested mainly, and I would say that's the same.
yeah.
But it's still too early for us to be
Okay,
really digging into this.
that's fair. All right. So what I'm
I'm kind of curious too. I've been thinking about this, and last time that you said, "Hey, we should do a cover board video to show people how they can measure nesting cover on their property," and then we got tons of comments and DMs and stuff saying, "Yeah, we would love to have that," so we produced that.
yeah,
Now it's up. We'll link it in the show notes if you've missed it. But uh, I've been thinking about doing the same thing with roost sites,
yes,
going out to roost sites. And if folks want us to make a really good long form video for the YouTube channel so you can see where our tag turkeys are actually roosting, let us know. And I've been thinking about doing it, but it
they're
takes a lot
gonna
of time.
they're gonna eat that up.
I think so.
I think there's gonna be a lot of energy behind that one.
Yeah. The problem is the turkeys are gobbling right now. And we're trying to track nests all over the place. Some of you may have seen, we just put up one of our videos about getting ready in the poult facility. We've been doing that for months, trying to get everything squared away. So we're about to start, with the poult work. So there's a lot going on. So I don't want to spend time on it unless people really want it.
Yeah.
Because
You know
it's,
what else? You know what else you need
we're
to do,
trying to,
Marcus?
what's that?
You need to take those mid-story and understory measurements around your roost sites.
Yes. I've already stored that one. That's happening.
Good. All
We
right.
got to do that.
So what I'm going to do now is because we're going to start getting into the more of the, well, these studies have some selection information in them too, but they were more focused on roost site fidelity. And so that basically is a complicated or uh, scientific jargon, if you will, way of saying, how often do they roost in the same area, basically.
Yeah. Are they using the same roost over and over again, or are they moving around a lot?
That's right. So there's 3 studies that I'm going to bump through real quickly here. One is Byrne et al. 2015. Uh, Former podcast guest Mike Byrne been on the show before talking about some of his work.
He may have even talked about this.
He may have, and so that study included Easterns and Rios, and then we have Gross and others 2015. That study also includes Easterns from Louisiana and Rios from Texas, and then Wakefield et al. 2020, and that is focused on solely on Easterns in Georgia. Okay, so in the Burns study, they found that the median inter-roost distance. So basically, if you take all the distances between consecutive roost sites and you find that middle number, right? It peaked in spring. So it peaked during the time of the year where we're hunting these birds. And
So, in
specifically,
other words, they were moving between like farther for roosting or
yeah,
less site fidelity
yeah, that's right.
during the breeding season. Okay,
Yes.
that makes
And
sense.
so that average or that median distance in this paper also included South Carolina. So the median distance for Easterns in Louisiana and South Carolina was 728 meters,
All right, 800 yards.
about 800 yards. Um, it was actually further for Rios. It was close to 1,000 meters.
Okay, dang.
Yeah.
That was the median distance between roost sites.
The median inter-roost distance. Yeah.
So does that? Let me make sure I'm understanding this. The median. What did you say?
Inter-roost.
Inner roost sites. So that's
That's a
consecutive
that's a
roost
new word to
nights.
add to your vocabulary today.
That's
Inter-roost.
that's consecutive roost nights.
Yeah.
So this roost, on average, is going to be 1,200 yards from the one last night.
I think that's accurate.
That's not very high site fidelity.
This is the stuff, as we're getting into all 3 of these studies, this is the stuff that kind of hurts my feelings as a turkey hunter because it causes conflict between the more anecdotal driven hunter side of me and the more
Yes.
objective scientist side of me. Because the
Yes.
objective scientist in me says these were GPS birds. This is about as accurate as you can get the information. But the hunter in me says, I know where that gobbler's going to be. He's going to roost, and so
Yeah.
many people I don't think I'm really in this category. I'm not in this category, but you
Well,
know
we have to think
how many
about it
veteran
from
turkey hunters have their turkey that they hunt each year, and they know where he's going to be day after day.
yeah, and they're chasing him around till finally
Yes,
he
and
does
trying
the
to
right
figure
thing.
him out. Yeah,
Well, I think there's multiple ways to look at this. One, this big old gobbler has a place that he likes to roost, and he does it day after day, and you're chasing that individual gobbler. Or two, there's a really good place to roost, and somebody is going to end up roosting there.
hmm
So I don't know how we would know the difference necessarily.
Well, the one thing that does make sense about it to the turkey hunter side of my brain is, if you will, is that a lot of times what you find is you go and hunt what you think is the same bird on consecutive days, but he does complete opposite of what he did the day before.
That's what I was going to say. One day he went this way, and the other day he went that way.
Could that
It's
be
like,
that it's just a completely different bird?
I would say that is a distinct possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. These are the things that keep us up at night and make us come back the next day to hunt again, right?
Yeah. That would be really interesting, and we've got hundreds of turkeys tagged now.
Yeah.
We have way over 100 tagged right now, and we have hundreds of bird years. There's some interesting questions to be had here.
Absolutely.
So
This is something else I should throw out there from this same paper, because what I presented before was the median inter-roost distance. They also provided, I forgot I made a note on it, the mean distance. So instead of choosing that middle number, we're taking an average here, right? The mean distance between consecutive roost sites was 600 meters for Louisiana and South Carolina. And it was, I didn't write down the exact number, but it was lower than that for Texas, is what my notes say. So less than 600 meters between those consecutive sites.
yeah,
That makes a little bit more sense.
yeah, it does.
So let's move on to Gross et al. 2015. And this is from Louisiana and Texas, so Eastern's in Louisiana, Rio's in Texas. Mean distance between consecutive roost sites was 800 meters in Louisiana. So there's one of those big numbers again. You know, there could be, what is it, 800 meters to yards,
900.
900 ish. You did the math, not me.
Well, that's a
And
half mile.
I know, but only 200 meters in Texas. That makes more sense.
Yeah, they're roosting right in the same spot.
That's right.
Basically.
Yeah. Because you can figure in a GPS signal has about a 30-meter resolution.
Yeah.
So there's some error in there. And
Well, I'm thinking about it a different way as a turkey hunter, which I'm sure there are some people out there thinking about this way. If that turkey roosts right here and I'm under him tomorrow, if he's 200 meters away, I can still hear him.
you'll still be able to hear him. Yeah.
Yeah, you could be listening in the same spot and hear the turkey, multiple days in a row if it's moving that much every day.
Yeah, that's right. So similar data from Wakefield and others 2020. This was on 2 WMAs in central Georgia. So obviously Easterns. They reported that the distance between consecutive roost sites averaged 952 yards. But what was interesting about that paper, so, we're talking about 1,000 yards almost,
It's a long way, man.
but the error on that was plus or minus 842 yards. So that means that there were birds that likely were using almost the same tree, and then there were other birds that were a county over
Yeah.
on consecutive nights.
Man, the individual variation.
So that's exactly what the take home was for me, is that, we can discuss these in averages, but remember that each bird is an individual, and some of them likely do have that preference to go
Yeah.
back to the same tree or nearly the same tree on a nightly basis, and others move around much more.
Everybody, all our listeners out there that are conflicted about these data are like, my turkeys are the ones that like to go back to the same roost. But I think that's where I didn't want to go there earlier, but I think now is the appropriate time. There's so much individual variation. There
Yes.
probably are turkeys, and I can tell you, based on some of the work that we're doing right now, not just with roosting, but it includes some roost site selection stuff in it. There's a huge amount of variation, and there are turkeys that are doing the same thing over and over every day, and other ones that, man, they look like nomads.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like, we can't really put our finger on what they're doing. They're just kind of doing their thing.
I would
And
also be interested to know how other factors like age, dominant status, coalition size, all those types of things factor into what individual birds do. Because you could see, like, if you took a dominant male that was in a coalition, like a breeding group of 4 with 3 other males, let's just say a total group size of 4, I could see those birds being much more likely to roost in the same place every night versus a single loner bird that's fairly subordinate in the pecking order, and he just gets bumped around and may not get the opportunity to roost where he wants to, so he's kind of pushed out to the side.
maybe so. These, you reminded me, I did not specify the data I was just talking about, which we're getting ready to send to a journal. That's from all hen data. But I know that there are both age classes, and all of it is pre-breeding season.
Yeah.
So, just kind of think about their winter
late winter.
Yeah, late winter uh, habitat use.
Right.
So that is telling that they found that and they have that amount of variation, and that's kind of my take home in general from what we're doing now. Our paper is not focused on that, but we were using it to set the stage for another analysis. And my take home from that analysis was, wow, there's a huge amount of individual variation.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another interesting little takeaway from that Wakefield paper too. And I'll just get your opinion before I share it. You probably already read this paper before, so you probably already know anyway.
I
But
have, but I don't remember.
would you expect the roost fidelity to be higher right before hunting season or after the hunting season opens?
Would I, without having any knowledge of any data,
Yeah, just
what would I
intuitively,
expect?
just
I would
logically.
expect that it would be lower sight fidelity after hunting starts.
Yeah, like hunting pressure makes them move around more, right?
Yeah,
They didn't find that.
really.
Yeah, they found that roost fidelity did not change before versus after hunting. Because that's one of the factors that
So
I
just
thought would.
ignore it.
That's one of the factors that I thought would make them less consistent. Is
Yeah,
hunting pressure. That it makes sense that they're responding to a threat of predation, right? So they're making themselves unpredictable or less predictable.
yeah. The flip side of that coin is maybe there's some roof sites that are really safe for one reason or another, like they're in the middle of a swamp that nobody can get to or something. You
Either
could
that or
see it
they
go
give
that.
them a lot of options for directions to travel from after fly down.
Yeah, yeah, you could imagine some scenarios where there might just be some places that are really safe,
Hmm.
even in during hunting. So, but that's interesting. They didn't find any effect of that stimuli.
In that study, I'll throw this out there because I know a lot of y'all would probably be interested to hear it, but they estimated home range size as part of it. And so this was, gobblers during the spring, and those home ranges range from 343 to 3,400 acres.
So there's a tenfold difference between
Yeah,
some
yeah.
individual.
Now keep in mind this
Wow.
is on heavy pressured public land, so
Yeah.
um,
But still, there was a home range that was 34 acres.
343
Oh,
was the smallest, and then
343.
yeah, and then
For
three
some reason, I remember back, I was like, wait a minute.
no,
That doesn't make sense.
it went up to over 3,000 was the
Okay.
largest. Yeah.
So if we put that in different context, because I don't know where these areas were and what they look like in terms of habitat quality, but
Well,
let's
they
just
were
say,
my PhD study site, so I'm
okay,
pretty
so you do.
familiar.
How
Yeah.
are they on habitat quality?
So Cedar Creek is part of a national forest. It does have, some active timber management going on, but the at least the portion that I worked on, which was the more northern portion of the forest, had a lot of closed canopy. They did burn in there, but most of it was like just fuel reduction, so there wasn't a
Mm,
lot of understory vegetation throughout the site.
okay.
Whereas the other site, BF Grant, was more actively managed from a forestry perspective. A lot more variation in the size and age classes of pines throughout it. A lot more prescribed burning. A lot more understory. And that site has a good bit of pasture in it too.
Let me ask you this. Was there any differences between the sites? Did they compare them at all?
I didn't see where they compared them. They may have, but I didn't catch it.
Well, that would have been an interesting opportunity to see in general how, you've got more active habitat management going on one site, it sounds like.
Hmm.
Are there any site specific differences? But I'm thinking of those gobblers on the 350 acre side of the home range. That, that's pretty reasonable for some, people that have a few hundred acres that you can keep some gobblers on your property for most of their time,
Hmm.
which is pretty encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be interesting to investigate that as a function of, what we think is habitat quality. Take areas that we consider good, median, poor.
Yeah. That's why I asked about the that comparison with those
Yeah.
sites, because as soon as you told me they are different quality. I
Yeah.
wanted to know that.
Yeah. Right.
We will have that data about 10 years from now.
But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing that's most baffling to me is that all of these studies are reporting greater than 700-meter differences between consecutive roost sites. The one exception to that was 600 meters on average for Louisiana and South Carolina in the Burn study. That's a lot. That's a long way.
Were they variable like the one that you said the variation on?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I do remember reading through those that I think it was probably like the gross study where the standard deviation was equivalent to the mean. So it was like 800 plus or minus 800 for the standard deviation.
Yeah.
So
So we're yeah, we're talking about 50% swings in the mean.
yeah.
Okay. So
So
that's quite variable.
yeah, this may just be one of those things that's really hard to characterize across all birds, and it may just be one of those things that is so individual specific that a summary statistic isn't going to capture it well.
Yeah. Seems that way. Well, what else do you have?
That's it.
That was all of it?
That was it.
Well, I guess we didn't resolve that age-old question of whether or not it's the same gobbler on the same roost.
Yeah.
I would say, based on that data, that it's pretty reasonable to assume that sometimes it is and sometimes it's not.
I
Probably
think that's
more
right.
often it's not.
Yeah. And maybe it is the case that if you do find a particular area that has one gobbler calling from the roost in the morning on a consistent basis, maybe that is the bird at the low end of that range. You know, if it was a site where there's usually two or three in the morning, I feel like maybe that would be less likely
Yeah.
because you're probably
Maybe
getting
so.
some mix up. I don't know. This is all opinion at this point.
Yeah. I think what we can say is there's pretty clear selection for certain types of roosts,
That's right.
and how much that roost is being used in consecutive days by the same birds might vary substantially, but that site is still a good roost site and it's very likely to have turkeys using it consecutive days.
Yeah.
So it is actually kind of interesting. Maybe Charlotte can cut in some of this footage. I don't know if we have it in a form that we can at this point, but I was going down trapping, helping our crews trap on these sites, and we had one place that kind of became our nemesis site that I kept getting put in the blind at this site because the first time I set in it, we snuck in there and set up everything right under the turkeys, basically.
Hmm.
And it was one of those situations like we described. We've got open pasture that we're setting a net in, and directly adjacent to it is a hardwood stand that's a wetland. And there were a few big pines kind of sticking their head up over the rest of the trees. And all those pines are what the birds were roosting in, and we could see them when they woke up on the
That's
roost.
cool.
And they would fly in to the pasture from the roost site,
Hmm.
or most of them did that. And we just couldn't get them in the right position because there were so many birds. We did end up catching 14 of them, I think. But we did that, and we had a camera on the site as well. For about 2 weeks in a row, they were hitting that site every day, and we could basically tell if they were on the camera right before fly up, that's where they were going to be roosted.
Yeah.
If they didn't, they were going to be there later in the day.
Yeah.
So they were cycling between multiple roost sites, but they were very consistently on that roost site, and I'm pretty confident that it was the same birds because it was a weird combination of, the group size was 18, I think, 17 or 18, something like that. there were 4 jakes, 3 longbeards, and the rest were hens, and some of those hens were jennies, which we now know. But the combination in the group was kind of odd, so I'm pretty confident it was the same group every time because it always was that combination of birds or something close to that.
Yeah.
So from my perspective for that group, they had really high site fidelity because they were roosting in that site most days for that 2-week period.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's another thing that I wanted to add. We would call that relatively low site fidelity potentially, because if the other roost that they liked was 3/4 of a mile down the creek, and they just go back and forth between the two, the mean could be 1,000 yards between them in consecutive nights, but they actually roost in 2 places every night, one of the two.
Well, to that point, I will say that a lot of these papers presented averages on the number of roosts used. So like in the burn paper, they reported that the mean number of roost sites in
We should have definitely talked about that.
In March for birds in Louisiana and South Carolina was 22. So on average, they had 22
separate roost sites.
22 separate roosts. That was the average in March.
On an individual bird.
On an individual bird basis.
On average, they'd have 22 different roost sites over 30 days.
Yeah. Louisiana and South Carolina.
But what constitutes a different roost site? Is it a different tree or a different place?
I don't know how they define that.
Yeah. Lots of questions, man.
To go back in those methods and dig out those details.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have them all linked, so if somebody is really curious and that's in your neck of the woods, we'll have it linked so you can go dig into it if you want more details.
If anything we said here today hurts your feelings, it does mine too. So take solace in that, or I don't know. You're either in good company or bad company, depending on your perspective.
Well, I think, if you're hearing birds consistently roosting in a spot, then that's a good indicator that's a good roosting spot, and it's likely to have some birds in it. Whether or not that's your big tom you've been chasing the last 4 years, I'd say it's pretty questionable.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I know that there's some veteran turkey hunters and, some old pro types that say that they can distinguish birds based on the sound characteristics of their gobble. I don't feel like I'm in that category, but I believe that there are people that can. And some of those people say that they know where that bird's going to be day after day, So,
yeah,
it's hard to reconcile.
Good stuff. All right. Well, I guess you ready to call it?
Yeah.
Well, good stuff.
I wish we knew more, but that's about all we know.
Yeah. Well, it may not be, we may be about as far as we can know.
Yeah.
There's so much variation and context specificity. But anyway, thanks everybody for listening. Let us know what you thought about the episode. Some of these resources we talked about we'll have linked. If you want us to develop some of these other resources, let us know in the comments. We appreciate all the support, and we're going to keep doing it. Turkeys are gobbling. Folks are getting hot.
And if you're listening on to the audio only version on one of the podcast platforms like iTunes or not iTunes, Apple Podcast or Spotify, make sure if you haven't already, leave us a review. We've not been really emphasizing that for a long time, but leaving those reviews not only helps us learn how to do better, but it also helps us get the word out. So the more of those reviews we have, the more widely shared and recommended the podcast comes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important. The engagement by the audience is really driving how the algorithm decides to distribute this. And hopefully if you've been listening to us, you think this is valuable and you think other people should hear it too. So that's one way that you can easily help us spread the word.
Yep. And hopefully there's some folks listening to this that are pulling up on a turkey spot right now thinking about where those birds are going to be roosted.
Yeah. Don't you love those screenshots that people post on Instagram or whatever and tag us in where they're clearly driving to go turkey hunting and you can see on their dashboard that they're listening to the Wild Turkey Science?
Yeah.
I love that.
I had somebody send me one of those that they caught on a hunting show the other day.
You sent me that screenshot. That was awesome.
They were going. It was
that was on the Hunting Public, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
Yeah.
they were listening in. So
Yeah.
that was cool.
Yeah. Really cool.
All right, man. I'll see you next time.
Yep. See ya.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.